Today I wanted to do some cleanup, and I may have mentioned this before, but I kind of want to remove this idea of a slug. Anytime I sort of demo the site, some people get confused as to what the slug even is. The slug is like a nickname for a space, and what I don't like about it is um, here we have the XR space, and then the slug would be the name of the space. To have it at the top level this way means that any characters you have behind the slash could be interpreted as a slug. So if you wanted something like um, uh, other namespaces, they um, you kind of have to pollute. It's inconsistent, in other words, because the other places will have namespaces, and then the slug doesn't have a namespace. So I think it would be more consistent, or at least with rest style, to have something like spaces and then the space ID, then everybody else can have their own subsequent namespace for whatever. The other thing is that the GraphQL API has mutations and queries that often take the slug as a parameter. And this was kind of done out of convenience, but if the slug can change on you, I don't think that's that great an idea. So maybe one day we can still have space by, you know, short for, you can have the slug here, and that's not too bad, I suppose. Or maybe we'll have another login page like like maybe at the top level there's a form that you fill in some code to allow you to get there. But the idea that you're creating a nice what do you call custom URL for it means that people will be competing for this, and maybe we just remove that out of the program at first. Whereas the UUID provides a very nice unique ID, people don't have to make it up, and it's just the ID of the space. So I'd like to change all the places that use the slug, including the let's see, the gen server registry currently uses the slug, so we use it a lot internally. So internal, like Elixir APIs also take the slug, and so I think we should change those into taking the space ID if possible. Any place that can take a space can also take the space ID, so I think we'd rather opt for space ID rather than space, unless you need both. If you need something on the space and you already have the space ID or space. What else? What else uses it? I think that's it. Okay, so where do we start? Well, most obvious place is probably in the model. So we have the creation of the space, creates a slug here. And so if we just remove this, then there's no way to enter a slug. That will break everything. We can remove this, create unique index on the slug, there just won't be any slug. Okay. What else? So, what about GraphQL APIs? GraphQL, sorry, schema, change these. So as space is this thing, ID, name, slug, so you can remove this. the definition of a space. And when you want to do space input, we'll take the space ID, that's an input, and description setting. Oh, this is if you want to create a new space, right? Yeah. Settings input is this. Entity. This is just ID is enough for the context of this. Entity space ID, yeah, it uses a space ID. That's consistent here. Component, that's entity IDs. Get all spaces. Spaces. Returns non-list of space and doesn't take any arguments. Get a space using the ID. Okay, so the query is called space and it returns a type of space. So maybe it's space by ID. Okay, so you give the ID, and then we go resolve that. And if we want to update a space, we give the ID of this and returns an ID. Give us the ID and the space input. In which case, space input should not have an ID on it then, right? You can't update the ID. Unless you say, here's the space input, it requires these things. No, I'd rather have it do this. If you want to modify that, you can't take the ID. You'll have to update a space, provide the ID, and then space input, and then go update the space. It seems fine. Okay, you want to create an entity, you'll need the space ID and the type, yes. And if you want to delete an entity, you just need to specify the, you don't even need, I think maybe we do because we want to broadcast on it, so we do need the space ID here. So we made a couple changes to the schema there. Resolvers undoubtedly are all broken. Used import data loader 3. Okay. So if we dig into the resolvers, we'll make changes here. So we've got spaces, that just lists all the spaces. Right, so hopefully that can be displayed. Get space by ID. Get space bang. Okay, so we want one that's maybe not a bang. Let's revisit this. Raises an error if you can't get it, so why don't we just do get space by ID. Find get space by ID, and then do crypto.get ID. And this returns either nil or the thing. And over here, do get space by ID, give it harbs ID, and case nil, give back what error? Do any of these give back error? Yeah, I think they do. Error and something, error not found. Otherwise, you have the space and return OK and the space. Create entity. We need to do one of these again. So let's try this. So here's our space. Does this work? Where's our ID? Slug. ID is here. Close that. And we compile spaces, get space by ID. With ID gives us this, yes. We'll do that, and then under the space, we'll do all of this stuff. That here, ID this. Case. Okay. Now we'd rather make this into a maybe a command. So maybe we can make a context for commands. Still put them under spaces. Command. Spaces, command center, command handler. My module vxr command spaces command handler. And we're gonna pluck all this, copy, and say that this is create entity. I need a space ID to know which place to put the entity, and I need the type. And in here we'll generate a new UID. We'll create a payload, entity created, and we'll have the type. It'll have the, what is the ID? ID is auto-generated ID here. Then it's the type with some randomness in there, some default position rotation scaling, and a timestamp, and then we say space server. The XR space server, and we'll process the event. Using the space ID. Now there's a thing here is that the the server needs to be alive in order to receive this. So what we could do is in process event, if you get an error like, hey, that thing's not there, then we rescue it and start the server, and then try again. So first of all, we would have to fix this thing. The process event currently takes a slug. So even how we start the space server right now, let's take a look at how we start it. So we go to space supervisor. When we're asked to start the space, we go start child with the space record. Start space can also take a slug. Okay, we'll just change this to the space ID. The identifier. Then here, get space. Let's do one of these. XR space get space by the ID. Space ID. Case nil. Back error not found. Otherwise, we have the space. This. Stop space should also require the space ID. So we'll get the PID of the space ID, child PID, and then we'll terminate that. So space server PID needs to take a space ID. ID via tuple, blah 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 blah. Ets refs should also use space ID. Essentially, every place that's using a slug should use a space ID. Remind me how to use a via tuple. I forgot. Elixir via tuple. So this can be used for the name. Access name processes using the tuple. Registry start link keys unique name. There's the registry. The name is via blah, 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 so that you can start a thing with that name. And then with this, okay, so you don't need the PID, you can just use the via tuple. PID does via tuple and then also does gen server where is. Just say yeah tuple. So start link via tuple, yes. And cast via tuple. Via tuple. PID is an extra utility. Here we can just do via tuple. 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 Make sure all that works right. So I don't get. Yeah, they're just using that as the wait a minute. Cast internally, yeah. I think you do need it. Yeah. Call. Okay, save call. this and a payload, and then when is PID ID. Are we using save call anywhere? Save call. This thing does take a PID here for safe call. Yeah, tuple. Okay, so then here it does PID. There's no guarantee that this is actually the right PID though. Let's remove save call for now. Remove this. Let's just call it regular gen server call. Right, where else do we find Slug? A bunch of places. Svelte sets the slug. Okay. Okay, so app Svelte expects it to be passed in and then it stores it for a context for any children. So who sets it for new app? So we look new app. There we go. We have this, and then we have this slug thing here. So slug is all over the place. Serialized space gets used with slug. Sure. Lots of places to update. There's only 107 results. Okay, let's start with some basic tests then. Okay, this whole test is commented out. We might as well delete this test. Space live test. Create a space, blah 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 blah. Okay, I don't feel like updating that one right now. What else? What else have we got? Spaces test. Okay, the fixture. Okay, let's look at space fixtures. Space fixtures. Okay, enum into create space. Create a space. New change that with errors. Create random slug if missing. So we don't need this anymore. Spaces don't need slugs anymore. Alright, let's cover the model. Let's just bite the bullet and start there. So let's go back to the migration. Let's bite the bullet, remove it out of here. So we don't need that, and we don't need this. That changes just about everything. And then the schema. This space is just a description and a name. That's it. It has other things on it. That's basically it. New change set says, okay, I'm going to cast the name and the description and validate that the name is required. Cast embed settings if provided. Okay. Edit the change set. You can give me this and no slug. Validate required, no slug. Settings, create random slug if missing, don't need that. Settings if missing, create random slug if missing, so we don't need this guy. I just deleted it. Okay. Alright, so no longer persist a slug when we create it. That means that our UI dependency on slug will need to change. So space live, where we create that. Let's go ahead and reload this. So mix ecto reset. Start our server. Let's see what trouble we get into. Okay, new space, A and A. Okay, key slug not found in space. Insert into spaces, that succeeded, but slug not found in space, where index HTML hex. Here we go. Nothing here. Nothing here. And may I see the index? Anything about slug in here? So we're going to mount this thing, list spaces, handle params, apply action. Want to edit something, you're using the ID, which is fine. Apply action, handle event. If you want to delete, which deletes the space, template clicked. I think it's okay now. Okay, n/spaces. Oh, space live index. I thought that was this. A slug in here. Slug There we go. Enter space path. Ooh, gotta change that route. Space path. Save this, but it's going to look like mix Phoenix routes. We have this thing that's called Slug. Why don't we just say S for space and then have the space ID? That can be the space controller. So let's go to our router. So the top level, we've got pipe through API, we've got API, graphical, then we have this thing which is the home page, and we've got S slash space ID. Space controller show. Space controller. Space ID, space by ID. That's the ID. And we can just put this in here. Okay, so if I hover over this, this gives you manage spaces, edit, this gives you /S, this thing. Enter, okay, slug not found, okay, one page at a time. Let's go to edit, edit still works. Manage spaces, edit. Manage spaces, delete goes to, okay, delete still works, okay, that's great. A and A, we've got our new thing, and then gobbledygook. If we enter here, we'll go into our show controller. So where are we here? We're in serialize. Let's look at the serialize method. Okay, we're not going to have that. We're going to have ID, space ID. Is that enough? Okay, got some stuff for it. So space equal get. Is there one space? Give me one space, yeah. And so now you can do spaces serialize space. Gives you, we've got no entities. Okay, that's right. Okay, that looks fine. Part's working. Go back. What else? Slug. Oops. let's just fix some of these tests, get it out of the way. Okay, so this was something that allows you to create a space. So we'll uncomment this, make it easy for this thing to pass. So we have some description, some name, no slug. No slug here. Invalid attributes that. Right, so we're going to create a space with a space fixture. Next, list all spaces. Space. Update spaces. Space in listing. Check anything about a slug. Mix test. Test. EXR web. Live. Space. Test it. Let's redo their database. Mix m equal test. Mix ecto reset. Test. 3 failures. Space show path. Undefined. Okay, so we don't do a show. That's because we use the controller to do that. So describe show. Just kill those tests. Now what? We want 4 tests, 1 failure. Slug not found somewhere. And when you're loading, slug not found. And something. Okay, broadcast space update. Okay, I think we can get rid of this. It's fine. Let's see. Spaces, broadcast space update. Spaces, broadcast. We have, yeah, space dot slug. Okay, so let's replace every space dot slug here. There's a couple of them with space dot ID. That'll be the new channel name, even though we're going to remove some of those things out. So any other references to slug? Get space by slug. We'll just get rid of this function. Any others? No. Run this test again. Okay, for that one, gets rid of some slug. That test. Now how about this one? So here we also have to get rid of this from fixture. Look how many slug do we have here? Space test. So slug here, slug here. Let's not updates with invalid data. Let's just make this the name. What else is there? Slug. No more. Okay, let's try to run this. So mix test. EXR spaces test. That's okay. Right. And snapshot test. Yeah, let's look at the snapshot test here. Spaces slug. We'll go to spaces ID. Events test. Go to ID. Edit menu. What is this? Templates. Oh, okay, this is the template for editing a space. Are we using this? I don't think that we are. This was the live view iframe that would pop up. And we are not using this now, right? Let's see. Is this using it? Let's see. I don't. Canvas. Doesn't look like it is. I don't see it including it. I think we can just get rid of it. Yep. Didn't seem to. I expect these should fail. Actually, I'm surprised it works. Okay. Fresh. Of course, that doesn't work. We probably got an error here regarding something or other. Okay. There's quite a large front-end dependency on the presence of a slug. So let's go back to slug. Who else mentioned slug? Only 60 results and 70 files. Okay. Schema. Delete an entity from a space. So we need the ID of the space. Space ID. And then the entity ID.